I wonder if I might start us off with maybe a unorthodox moment, a little bit of personal vulnerability. I'll share with you that one of the elements of becoming a leader, of growing to be a mature kind of director of an organization for me, has been a pathway of maybe shaving off some of the rough edges of my youthful exuberance, understanding that there are some trimmings to my temper that need to be controlled, knowing that my enthusiasm can be shaped and focused. I think maybe a journey that many of us have been on. But I'll share with you the vulnerability. I think there is something universally human about having to call a call center that brings out the very worst of our emotions. A telephone company, a utility, technology support, where somehow all of that strong held and well-developed control somehow goes out the window when you face that just intractable bureaucracy. Well, the other day I had a chance to look at the demo of a new piece of AI software, and it sits in call centers and it empowers the person on the other end of the phone. Now, not necessarily to find a solution to your problem, but with ongoing sentiment analysis to help that person you're speaking with know that maybe you're a little bit angry, maybe you're a little bit frustrated, maybe a little bit more than a little bit. I was really struck by this piece of software. In many ways, it empowers a human to do that which that a human is only supposed to be able to do, to understand the emotions, the sentiment, the interests of the person on the other side of a conversation, and to respond in a way that presumably not only gets them to their preferred outcome, but also hopefully smooths the emotional friction they experience in getting to it. Now, it opened for me a number of questions. What is empathy in the construct of an AI-defined system, a supported system? And where perhaps my example today is a little bit easy and facile, when we begin to think about how AI systems empower decision-making in systems of justice, in systems of policy and mechanisms where people have vulnerability and power differentials, it raises a number of questions. Where does empathy truly reside in the decision made by a system and a human? But perhaps more importantly, how do we begin to shape a future of AI that's guided by principles that further kind of human interests, that allow empathy to be a primary player in the conversation? With that framing, I'm delighted to be here with John Tassioulas. John, you are, as you know, somebody I look to often to help me figure out the thorniest parts of these problems. And in your scholarship and in your leadership, I've learned so much from you. So, John, if you will, maybe I can ask you a question to start us off in a fast-moving discussion. You speak often about the need to bring the arts and the humanities into the design of both the technologies themselves and the systems in which they operate. You've proposed a kind of 3 Ps model. I wonder if you could share a little bit about that, maybe to kick us off.
Thank you so much, Felix, and it's great to be in conversation with you again in this different format this time. I think empathy is a good way into this, because what I'm saying is that the arts and the humanities have got a great deal to contribute to our thinking about the ethics around AI. And I should say that I know there's sometimes skepticism about ethics. I've heard previous speakers say things like, oh, we need to get beyond ethics. I think that assumes that by ethics, we're talking about vague principles that are not enforceable. Whereas when I'm talking about ethics, I'm talking about Socrates' question, which is how we should live. And that question is always front and center in all forms of regulation, whether they're legal regulation or softer forms of regulation. But the arts and humanities precisely bring empathy, because unlike the sciences, in science, you don't ask what molecules think about their behavior. That's not relevant. But in the arts and the humanities, in order to come up with explanations, you have to take on board the point of view of the people that you're trying to understand. So already built into the arts and humanities is the understanding of the interiority that is characteristic of human behavior. And there's no full explanation of it that doesn't capture it. So my thought is that the arts and humanities can help us push back against some forms of AI ethics that are overly quantitative in orientation, that are overly formalistic. So in particular, I have in mind the dominance of a kind of uncritical preference-based utilitarianism that says, what you really need to do is get the data on people's preferences and maximize the fulfillment of those preferences. But those preferences could be skewed in various ways. They could be prejudiced, they could be ill-informed, etc. So what are the 3 Ps that I'm proposing as an alternative? Well, the first one is pluralism. We have to recognize there is a plurality of values. There isn't one particular value that we're there to optimize. and that these values can often come into conflict. So I think this pluralism is very important on many levels, and maybe we can discuss some of them with us. But one thing I would say, for example, even well-meaning people who want to say things like, let's have a human rights-based approach to AI. Well, is human rights sufficient? What about things that are not human rights violations, like, for example, forms of dishonesty or forms of incivility? They don't necessarily violate someone's rights, but they're bad things and they're not part of a good ethical culture. Or what about things like mercy? We don't normally think people have a right to mercy, but nonetheless, it is a valuable quality. Or what about the impact of AI on the environment, on non-human animals? That can't be fully understood in terms of human rights. So one aspect is getting a sufficient understanding of the diversity of values in play. And often people who advance strongly the role of AI often try to flatten out the problems by saying there's really only one kind of issue we need to optimize for. So in bail decisions, we really have to think about, is this person likely to reoffend? Well, actually, no. There are many factors in bail decisions, and you can't cut them down so as to enable your tools to operate. That's getting things back to front. So pluralism is one factor. Another factor is procedures. We don't just care about valuable outcomes. We care about how those outcomes are brought about. We care about, for example, whether a good decision can be explained. That's a matter of procedure. We care about whether a good decision, there is someone who can be held accountable for it and is responsible for it. And it's, as you know, Vilas, very doubtful that we have adequate forms of explainability or accountability in pure AI frameworks. And the third thing that I wanted to emphasize is participation, the third P. And that is sometimes the valuable process we look to is one that involves our active participation. So if you have a worldview where you're just talking about the fulfillment of preferences, my preferences could be fulfilled by me being entirely passive. But that isn't really, for my money, what's at the heart of a good life. What's at the heart of a good life is my active participation in seeking my own good. And this is both at an individual level, for example, at work. If work is one of the great scenes in which we actively participate to realize our good, what's going to happen if AI is deployed in such a way that it eliminates those possibilities? And at a collective level, and there I would in particular emphasize democratic self-governance, that we participate together in reaching decisions, and we do so in a way that involves free and equal citizens genuinely deliberating. And now we're back to empathy. I can't genuinely deliberate with you unless I make a sincere effort to take on board your point of view, to listen to your reasons, and then respond in kind with my reasons.
You know, John, there's so much in there that I think is worth exploring, and we have 20 minutes, so maybe we'll jump to a few of the key points. One is something that I think about often, which is in many of the conversations that we have at a normative level, I think particularly in the public discourse, it feels like there is a presumed inevitability of the technological direction of what we will shape. That somehow, whether through key decision makers that are defining decisions for all of us, or because of forcing conditions, what will be will be. And our role maybe is to try to nudge and shape it. Now, you know that in our conversations, you know that I'm quite a pragmatic person, and I lead an institution that fundamentally believes in an alternative pathway, that there are decisions to be made now that fundamentally reshape and make choices for us through an entire options tree. But as you talk about kind of these principles that underlie pluralism, particularly, and participation as well, how do you think about the fundamental construct that even as these decisions happen in a normative ethical framework, technology companies and product builders are out there building things today that maybe aren't at all touching these conversations?
Well, that's a very good question, one I'd like to turn back on you, actually. But really, if we're talking about ethics, we're talking about choices, because ethics is about appraising choices. It assumes that we have options, and then we have to evaluate those options. And one of the ways in which things can go wrong is if we convince ourselves that there is no real option, that there are no real choices. So in very recent memory, we've seen globalization spoken about in this way. So globalization is a process that's happening. It's sweeping all before it. There is no issue about choice. We simply have to comply with globalization or there's no survival. And I think we've seen that that's a mistake. We've seen a big backlash against some of the forms of economic organization that have been built up around globalization. I think, Vilas, that a similar worry should occur to us about AI when there's this kind of technological determinism that is being put forward. So this is something I'd actually really like to ask you. How does an organization like your own make people feel that there is a sense in which their fate with respect to AI is in their hands? And it's not simply a matter of some inexorable force that is going to sweep them away and over which they had no control.
Yeah. It's a fair question, and that imagery of that inexorable force that will sweep us away, I think, is what renders so many powerless in entering into a public conversation. We think often about what is the shared reality that's inhabited by the policymakers represented quite well on this call, by the academics and theorists, and really those who are at the frontier of building these products and technologies. I think at that last point, things begin to break down quite a bit. I think as an organization and really as an ecosystem, we're trying to do more of that connective tissue. How do we actually bring somebody who is an expert in machine learning, that understands that a challenge like integrating geospatial data with citizen reported experiences in the context of climate change is not merely a technological problem. It's also not merely a policy problem, that fundamentally it is building the primary drivers and behaviors which allow people to participate in a world in which solutions are defined by a juxtaposition of all of these factors happening simultaneously. Now, the question still remains, right? That's quite a great maybe hypothesis and an intention, but to understand that that happens effectively, it must happen at scale, that it has to have national policymakers who are stepping in and committing to the idea that educational systems have to align back to core principles around ethical and social responsibility, that industrial mechanisms can't simply be regulated, but really have to involve a voluntary intention on the part of technology creators to engage in these conversations, and that academics need to be supported in doing exactly the work you do, bringing really theoretical and important work into practicality. Does that resonate for you? And I'm curious a little bit of kind of what you're doing at the Institute to further that agenda.
Well, I mean, this is one of our main hopes, that we can somehow do two things. One is try to feed in our discussion and try to model for a wider community, a kind of rational civil discussion around these matters, and feed it into a wider democratic discourse. But also, I'm really interested in trying to develop mechanisms whereby ordinary citizens can come into our discussions. That's going to be one of our priorities in coming years. How do we find formats in which it's not just that we send out a message there, which we want to do in certain respects, but that we are also attentive to the experiences of people. I mean, I like that expression of Aristotle's where he says, sometimes the person who lives in the house knows more about it than the architect who designed it, right? And I think as we increasingly live in the house of AI, we have to find formats that enable ordinary people to enter into these discussions. We find out a lot from them. And, one example that I thought was very interesting, someone who was working with ex-offenders, and they were saying, oh, they would rather be sentenced by a human judge than by an AI tool. And the psychologist who was reporting this was saying, well, of course, if the AI tool was really effective, I'd rather be sentenced by the AI tool. But I think it's worth pondering. Why would someone with real experience in the criminal justice system say they would prefer a human being sentencing them? And I think it's around these issues of accountability and explainability, and also just the solidarity of having your fate decided by a fellow human being. All this comes from actually widening the discourse and bringing into the conversation people who are normally excluded.
To go back to that Aristotle quote, John, I often think about the fact that not every person on the planet needs to be a technologist. Not everybody needs to be an architect, but everybody has a sense of aesthetic, right? In the classical sense of the word. Yes. That people should be involved in design decisions in ways that express their sovereignty and their agency in meaningful ways. I know we have only a few minutes left, and I wonder if we can come back to one of our weighty topics here as we do our sampler tour of a broad field. You just alluded to this point that even in the structures of rule of law, where we attempt to set policy and guidelines and decision-making frameworks, we've consistently and traditionally also allowed for the discretion of individuals, those who implement the rule of law as it sits at the front line and affects a vulnerable party. A judge is a perfect example, but there are so many more. We've always understood that having the human who can bring the empathetic, the consequential, and the contextual understanding of the framework needs to be an interpreter of law. How does that framework change when you plug an AI system into that decision-making loop? And you alluded just now to the criminal justice system, but there are so many maybe less consequential in their individual form decisions that can add up to have a meaningful effect in someone's life as well.
Well, it's a really big question, Vilas. I think there are a lot of voices right now saying to us, look, there's so much inconsistency within the legal system. Look at how judges' sentences, for example, vary depending upon the time of day or whether they had their dinner or whether their football team won, etc. Surely, if we had an algorithm deciding these things, we could eliminate this inconsistency, which is incompatible with the rule of law. So that's a major theme in the book Noise by Kahneman, Sibony, and Sunstein that's just come out. Unwanted variability. Think about how it operates in decision-making with respect to asylum seekers. Huge variations in the United States. Some judges 18 times more likely to grant asylum than others. So you can see there's a kind of impetus from a rule of law perspective to replace human beings with machines because the algorithm won't be subject to this kind of variability. Now, there are many problems with this, but at least one kind of problem you might have goes back really to Aristotle. Aristotle said, look, yes, we do need rules. We do need the consistent application of rules, but no rule, no matter how precise and how intelligent, can anticipate all future circumstances. So Aristotle says we need to temper the application of law by reference to equity. We need to know when it's the right thing to deviate from the application of law, the strict application, in order to avoid doing an injustice. And one of those areas, and one reason you might want to deviate from the strict application of law, is compassionate grounds, so what we would call mercy. So the worry is in being impressed by certain kinds of tools that promise certain kinds of benefits, in particular algorithmic consistency, we get so dazzled that we forget about the fact that the application of law is a human enterprise that goes beyond simply the application of pre-existing rules. It requires capacity for empathy that is part of equitable discretion, also part of merciful discretion. I wonder if you have any thoughts about how do you bring in ideas like mercy and ideas like empathy into the operation of AI systems, Vilas?
Yeah. Again, John, every time we have a conversation, I've got 20 different topics that we need to follow up on. But let me say one thing. As you bring forward these topics, particularly of mercy, right? Empathy, mercy, the ideals under which a system builds, and I'll come to one of those keywords, trust, between an individual and a system, between a citizen and a system of laws, that trust is defined not necessarily by each of the characteristics that we've talked about today, empathy, mercy, and so on, but rather trust that the creators, the implementers, and the participants in the system will together form a shared compact under which empathy and mercy and other topics are lifted up, are made a part of the system. Now, it strikes me, and this is a deep concern, right? And one of the reasons why I've committed my life to this work as you have, that as we have conversations about the development of AI systems, we are quite naturally and quite importantly focused on the design of those systems, but have not yet stepped forward into a decision-making framework around what society we build when those tools are used. So just to respond briefly to your question, I think at the end of the day, civil society plays a particularly important role as it thinks about vulnerability, but also about trust. That civil society is often meant and really is only created to fill in the gaps, if you will, between where governments and systems find friction in their interaction. And so on each of these topics, it strikes me that this may be a place where we exit the conversation, that the invitation then becomes, how do we invite each of these elements of the decision-making framework to consider these more structural pieces, to go back to Aristotle's framework, to architect not simply a house, but to architect the village that we all live in together. With that, maybe to you for a final word, and I really enjoyed this. Thanks for taking this time with me, John.
Thank you so much, Vilas. Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right about trust. Trust is not simply a psychological attitude, it has to be earned. And then the question is, what are the background conditions that make the earning of trust something that is legitimate? And the thing that I would really emphasize, and I think it's consonant with what you've been saying, is you need to have robust forms of democratic oversight in order for trust to be intelligently and well placed. And I think this is going to be a very important question, whether we can, in fact, actually mobilize some AI technology to enhance our capacity to exert that kind of robust democratic oversight, or whether instead, in the dystopian scenario, AI will actually be one of the factors that corrodes our ability to exercise that kind of oversight.
Well, on that note, to bring us back to optimism, that we know that there is a better path forward with our shared decisions and intentionality. Thanks so much.